"Get out of my country and never come back." Those 9 words sent shockwaves across the world. They weren't shouted in protest or muttered in secret. They were spoken, face to face, by a sitting African president to the CEO of one of the most powerful mining corporations on earth. Cameras rolled. Ministers stood silent in awe. The man on the receiving end, Richard Morrison, the iron-willed executive of Glenor, a Swiss mining juggernaut, was expecting a handshake, not a public execution of his empire. He had arrived in the presidential palace of Burkina Faso dressed for another easy negotiation. For 50 years, his company had extracted Africa's minerals, corrupted its officials, poisoned its water, and called it development. For 50 years, Glenor had operated with the confidence of a colonial power in the age of independence, shielded by lawyers, cloaked in contracts, and fortified by the silence of those it harmed. But that silence had just ended. Ibrahim Traoré, a military captain turned head of state in his 30s, didn't just reject the deal. He brought receipts. For 2 hours, he walked Morrison, and the watching world, through decades of theft, lies, and corporate violence. From satellite images of illegal mines to bank statements showing stolen billions, to photos of children dying from mercury poisoning, Traoré pulled the curtain back on a system built to extract wealth and leave devastation behind. This wasn't just about Glenor. This was about every foreign company that had treated Africa as a mine to be emptied rather than a continent to be respected. And it was about showing the world what happens when one country dares to fight back. What you're about to see is not fiction. It's not exaggeration. It's the story of how a young leader broke the rules of global exploitation, and triggered a revolution across Africa. Richard Morrison arrived in Burkina Faso expecting another routine performance. A firm handshake, a few stern words, and another multi-million-dollar agreement sealed under the guise of foreign investment. After all, this wasn't his first visit to an African capital. CEOs like him had grown used to presidents eager for deals, willing to overlook violations in exchange for vague promises of development. But this time, things were different. When Morrison stepped into the grand hall of the presidential palace, he immediately sensed the tension. Armed guards lined the walls. A semicircle of ministers sat stone-faced. Journalists, both local and international, occupied hidden corners, cameras quietly rolling. This was no negotiation. At the center of it all stood President Ibrahim Traoré. No suit. No teleprompter. Just a stack of files, a massive LED screen behind him, and the unshakable poise of a man with nothing left to fear. "You thought this day would never come," Traoré began, his voice slicing through the air. "You thought you could poison our children, steal our wealth, destroy our land, forever. You were wrong, Mr. Morrison. Your reign of terror ends now." Then came the evidence. First, images, satellite views of mining sites Glenor never declared, maps of illegal expansions in protected regions, photographs of children with distended stomachs from drinking poisoned water. One photo lingered on screen, a 7-year-old girl named Marie who died from mercury-induced kidney failure. Her village, once a farming community, was now abandoned, a crater where crops used to grow. Next, documents, leaked emails, offshore bank statements, and Glenor's internal projections calculating the cost-effectiveness of paying compensation versus installing safety measures. One document stood out, a spreadsheet labeled African Death Projections. It estimated annual fatalities from various operations and what the minimum legal payouts would cost. The room grew colder. Morrison tried to interrupt. He reached for familiar tactics, legal jargon, diplomatic bluffing, corporate charm. But Traoré cut him off. "Your lawyers cannot save you. Your threats mean nothing here. Your bribes are worthless. Then came the final blow, a recording. Glenor executives, caught mocking African leaders as cheap and easy to control, laughing about how little it took to buy their compliance. What Morrison thought would be a private meeting had become a tribunal. Not just of one man, but of a system. This was not just a confrontation. It was an exorcism of decades of silent suffering. And Traore was just getting started. The room had already seen enough to turn stomachs, but President Traore wasn't done. What came next transformed corporate malpractice into something closer to a war crime. Behind him, the giant screen lit up again, this time with a cascade of whistleblower documents his cyber team had recovered from Glenor servers during a security audit. What they found wasn't just damaging. It was monstrous. Glenor, it turned out, had maintained intelligence dossiers on nearly every African leader in countries where it operated. Detailed reports on their weaknesses, addictions, mistresses, even psychological profiles. The company had a department, internally dubbed Governance Strategy, whose job was to compromise officials through bribery, coercion, or blackmail. They called it, ensuring operational continuity. One file read like something from an intelligence agency: target younger officials before they develop principles. Exploit tribal divisions to prevent unified resistance. Maintain poverty to ensure desperation and compliance. Never allow local processing of raw materials. These were not just tactics. This was Glenor's African business model. And then came the financials. In Burkina Faso alone, Glenor had extracted over $320 million worth of gold and rare earth minerals in 2 decades. But on official books, the company reported less than $40 million in profit. The rest? Disappeared through a tangled web of shell corporations, tax havens, and consulting fees, routed through Luxembourg, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. What could $320 million have bought us? Traore asked, his voice tight. Free healthcare. Clean water. New roads. Modern schools. A future. Instead, it bought yachts in Monaco. It built mansions in Zurich. It paid bonuses to executives who had never stepped foot in the communities they destroyed. One document caused a murmur even among the stone-faced ministers, a Glenor memo estimating how many people would die each year from proximity to mining operations, and what the acceptable level of fatalities would be per $1 million in profit. The memo calculated, with chilling precision, that African lives were less expensive than safety upgrades. You had a formula, Traore said, visibly shaking with rage. A mathematical formula for how many African deaths were worth each dollar in your pocket. And every time, the answer was the same: too cheap to matter. He paused. Not anymore. The truth was now undeniable. This wasn't just corporate negligence. This was premeditated abuse, sanitized with accounting software and buried under legal protections. But those protections were crumbling. And the reckoning had just begun. Then came the moment that changed everything, not just for Glenor, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent watching in real time. President Traore walked toward Morrison and dropped a folder onto the table with finality. Inside was the legal instrument Glenor had feared for years but never believed would come: a full-scale eviction notice. Effective immediately, Traore declared, all Glenor operations in Burkina Faso are nationalized. Every mine, every vehicle, every document. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your executives have 24 hours to leave the country or face arrest for crimes against humanity. Morrison stood, stunned. This is illegal, he stammered. We have contracts. International law protects us. You'll be sued into oblivion. Traore didn't flinch. Sue us with what authority? The same courts that let you poison our children? The same laws that let you rob us blind for 50 years? We recognize no authority that values contracts over human lives. Those contracts were signed with traitors and paid for with blood. They are worthless. As security personnel moved to escort the executives out, cameras captured every second. Morrison, once a titan of industry, now looked like a fugitive. The walls of privilege and impunity were collapsing in real time. But Traore wasn't finished. Before Morrison could leave, Traore delivered one final warning: we've sent all of this, every document, every video, every bank statement, to the governments of every African country where you operate. Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Congo, Zambia, Tanzania. They're all taking action. And within hours, they did. In Ghana, the president called an emergency parliamentary session to review all Glenor-related contracts. Nigeria's Financial Crimes Unit froze Glenor's assets pending investigation. South Africa launched a judicial commission with full subpoena powers. The Democratic Republic of Congo suspended all Glenor concessions indefinitely. The tide had turned. What began as a national act of justice had become a continental revolt. In Zurich, Glenor stock went into freefall. Phones rang off the hook in London, Washington, and Geneva. Crisis meetings were convened. But it was too late. The monopoly was broken. Even more powerful than the eviction itself was what Traore had built before that day. He had secretly negotiated with state-owned enterprises in Brazil, China, and India. Companies willing to purchase African minerals at fair prices, invest in local processing, and train African workers. He had prepared for the post-Glenor era with precision. So when Glenor fell, there was no vacuum. There was only momentum. As Glenor's executives scrambled for flights and security forces secured their compounds, something even more powerful was unfolding, a transformation not just of policy, but of purpose. President Traore didn't waste a single day. Within 24 hours of the eviction, his administration took control of Glenor's largest mining sites. But instead of celebrating revenge, they focused on reconstruction. Engineers were deployed to inspect infrastructure. Accountants began inventorying equipment. And most importantly, workers, once treated as disposable, were brought together for a new beginning. Standing atop a platform in front of thousands of miners, Traore made a simple declaration: from today, you no longer work for Switzerland. You work for Burkina Faso. Your children will benefit from the wealth beneath your feet. Cheers erupted, but what followed wasn't just symbolic. Salaries were tripled overnight. Safety equipment that Glenor had once deemed too expensive was ordered in bulk. Plans for local processing facilities were fast-tracked, projects that would create thousands of skilled jobs and finally break the old model of raw extraction and export. Revenue that had once flowed silently into offshore accounts now surged into public coffers. In just 6 months, mining revenue increased by 800%. Funds were directed toward building modern hospitals, upgrading schools with computers and labs, restoring roads, and, for the first time, providing clean drinking water to communities ravaged by pollution. But the transformation wasn't just economic. Every mining contract was made public online. Real-time revenue dashboards were launched. Independent environmental monitoring was mandated for every operation. Citizen oversight committees were established to ensure accountability, a revolution not just in governance, but in trust. International reaction was predictably split. Western governments condemned the move. Corporate media painted Traore as a radical. The World Bank and IMF issued vague threats about investment risk. But new voices were louder. Human rights groups praised the bold action. Environmental organizations released their own damning reports on Glenor. Activists around the world hailed Burkina Faso's stand as a model of ethical resistance. And the ripple effect didn't stop at Africa. In Peru, prosecutors reopened old cases involving Glenor's copper mines. In Colombia, lawmakers demanded answers about coal operations. In Kazakhstan, officials began reviewing oil deals. A multinational empire once deemed untouchable was now under siege. But perhaps the most powerful symbol came when Traore returned to a village that Glenor had destroyed. He brought with him doctors, engineers, and construction crews, not just to apologize, but to rebuild. "This is where the healing begins," he told the villagers. And this time, no one is left behind. In the months that followed, the numbers told the story better than any speech ever could. Mining revenue to the Burkina Faso government had skyrocketed. Local employment in the sector quadrupled. Communities once left in ruin now had schools with laboratories, hospitals with real equipment, and clean water that no longer poisoned children. Environmental restoration was no longer a dream, it was happening, funded directly by the seized assets of Glenor. But what changed most profoundly was something harder to measure, the psychology of a people who had spent decades being told they were powerless. Young Africans who once dreamed only of escape were enrolling in mining engineering and environmental science. Entrepreneurs were launching local processing startups. Diaspora professionals returned home, drawn by the possibility of being part of something bigger than themselves. The spark had caught. And it was spreading. Across the continent, countries rewrote their mining laws, renegotiated contracts, and demanded technology transfers. No longer were they competing to offer the weakest regulations and lowest taxes. The race to the bottom had ended. A new race, one toward dignity, sovereignty, and shared prosperity, had begun. For Richard Morrison, the fall was total. From boardroom kingmaker to a disgraced symbol of corporate criminality, his name became toxic. No company would touch him. His fortune, frozen. His reputation, destroyed. And in African schools, he was no longer a feared figure, he was a cautionary tale. But for President Ibrahim Traoré, the moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ego. It was about proving that Africa could rise, not by begging for aid, but by reclaiming what had always been theirs. He institutionalized the change. Every contract online. Every revenue stream transparent. Environmental watchdogs empowered, not suppressed. The model he built in Burkina Faso became a blueprint for the continent. And it all began with the courage to say two words, "Get out." Those words were more than defiance. They were the sound of a continent waking up. A declaration that Africa is not for sale. That African lives are not disposable. That African resources will no longer build other nations' wealth at the cost of their own. The revolution had begun. And there was no turning back. For decades, the people of Africa had watched their lands drained, their rivers poisoned, and their voices ignored. They had been told, in subtle and loud ways, that this was simply the cost of development. That their suffering was unfortunate but necessary. That the corporations were bringing jobs, infrastructure, and progress, even as villages emptied, diseases spread, and profits vanished offshore. But on that day, when Ibrahim Traoré looked the CEO of Glenor in the eyes and said, "Get out," something shifted. Across the continent, ordinary Africans, farmers, teachers, miners, students, felt something they hadn't felt in generations: vindication. In Burkina Faso, elders in the mining towns wept watching the live footage. Not out of sorrow, but because someone had finally said the words they had buried in silence for decades. The pain of watching their children suffer from illnesses with no names, their wells turn black, their fields crumble into toxic dust, all of it was suddenly, fiercely, publicly acknowledged. A woman named Aissata, whose husband died working for Glenor, told local reporters, "We buried our men in silence, thinking no one would ever speak for us. Today, the president spoke for all of us. For the first time, I don't feel like a widow. I feel like a witness to justice." Young people who had been planning their escape, saving every franc for a visa out of Africa, found themselves imagining a future here, on their own soil. Engineering students at the University of Ouagadougou began organizing workshops on ethical mining and environmental monitoring. One student said, "If we are going to rebuild our industries, we have to be the ones leading it. Not foreigners. Not thieves. Us." In Ghana, a radio call-in show was overwhelmed by callers demanding the same action. "Why should Burkina Faso be the only ones brave enough to stand up?" One caller asked. "Our resources are not just under the ground, they're under our feet. And we must stand on them with pride." In Nigeria, community organizers in oil-rich but impoverished regions held town halls. For years they had battled multinational oil giants with little support. Now, they saw that action was possible. One activist in the Niger Delta said, "This was not just a policy. It was a declaration of dignity. And dignity is contagious." Even African diasporas around the world felt the shift. In Paris, London, and New York, young Africans held watch parties, posted reactions, and shared the video of Morrison's eviction like it was a scene from a liberation movie. But it wasn't fiction, it was a new chapter of history being written in real time. The emotion wasn't just pride. It was relief. A sense that finally, someone had called out the lies. That Africa was no longer begging for justice, it was taking it. And it wasn't just about Glenor. It was about every company, every government, every deal signed in dark rooms that had profited from African suffering. The people didn't just want justice for the past. They wanted accountability for the future. In the markets of Lusaka, in the coffee shops of Nairobi, on the streets of Dakar, the question was no longer, "Can we fight back?" It was, "Who's next?" Hope is a powerful thing. But hope backed by proof, that justice is possible, that power can be confronted, is even more powerful. For the first time in living memory, Africa had witnessed not a speech, not a promise, but a reckoning. And its people had not just watched it. They had felt it.